And so I'm going to overlap a little bit with what has been said before, but hopefully bring some new ideas with this idea of provenance and scientific exploration here. So I want to start with a few different ideas, some of which have been discussed before, some of which maybe haven't. I think this was brought up in the last session by Mike on orchestrating different tools, right? Workflows are meant to orchestrate a lot of different tools. And one of the things I like about the word orchestrate is it's not just making tools all run together, because you can have a trumpet, you can have a violin all playing together, and it may not sound very good. You need to have them orchestrated, right? And so bringing together different tools, bringing together different libraries is a key piece in any sort of complex computation. And so there's a lot of different tools out there, programming languages, R, Python. There's been some talk of Julia. There's different libraries. This is by no means a comprehensive list. Things like NetCDF, ParaView, OpenMP, OpenCL, other things like that. And so orchestration, bringing all these things together, I think is one of the challenges that needs to be addressed in really doing good scientific work. And another piece here that was been discussed at least a couple times is abstraction and bringing structure to computation. So this is a painting by Paul Klee, and it's sort of an early idea of abstract art here. But what he's showing, this is Temple Gardens, and you can still see some of the structure in this painting, right? But they're broad shapes that are being drawn here. So you get an idea of what's going on in the painting without all very fine detail. And so this abstraction can often help a lot of people understand what's going on in a computation. You can bring them and sort of immediately get some recognition of what the general process is. And I think that's important when you're dealing with very complex analyses, again. And so this is one of the slides I like to show here when I'm talking about workflows. And I point to the right side and I say, look, it's pretty. There's computational modules. You just set parameters by clicking on the modules. And there's this script on the left-hand side that does the same thing, and it's Python. And people look at me and say, well, that left side looks pretty good to me. Scripts aren't that bad. It's very well structured. You can see the different pieces of what's being created. It's using VTK, which is a well-structured library. And I agree here, right? I mean, structured and abstracted code, it doesn't have to be a pretty-looking interactive workflow. This structure and abstraction can come about in normal scripting as well. And so when I show workflows, one of the things I actually worked on for a little bit was actually translating the VTK examples to workflows. And there's a nice mapping back from the scripts to the workflows. So, it's not to say that these workflows, these modules and ports and things like that have to live apart from scripts. Another piece that's come up is testing and ensuring quality reliability. I don't want to talk about testing as much, but I do want to talk about quality, reliability, and trustworthiness. An example here is the famous Intel Pentium bug with the FDiv error. One of the things that comes up there is, okay, why didn't they test it enough? What better ways could they have done to try to find that error before they produce the chip? But the other thing is, on the flip side, is what computations may have been affected by that. Well, the Pentium was mostly used in home computers. It wasn't a big deal for a lot of computational work at the time. But if you think about errors like that in codes or in libraries, understanding what may have been affected, what results were generated when there was a buggy library, when there was some sort of an issue along the way, that's something that is important. And so that's not just testing before you put something out there, but what if something was wrong in a library that you're using or somebody else was using in their computations? And so this gets to an idea that comes from the art world called Provenance. And the idea there is that you want to be able to trace back to the original owner, to the original commissioning of a painting. So if I want to go out and buy a Rembrandt, or if I want to go to the National Gallery of Art and look at Rembrandt, I would like some assurance that what I'm looking at is an actual Rembrandt and not a forgery, especially if I'm buying it, right? And so the galleries like this have lists of, George the Third Duke of Montagu was the original owner from his inheritance, or it was generated by inheritance to his daughter, and so on and so forth before it was given to the NGA. And so that brings some trustworthiness by having that lineage all the way back of understanding where this result or where this piece of art has been, generating that authenticity. And the same sort of idea applies in science. It's often not called provenance, but it's the same idea of the lineage of data, a computation or a visualization. And it's something that's been a hallmark of the scientific process. People keep track of what they do for every step in testing a hypothesis or in generating some sort of result. And so that log of what's been going on is often more important than the result, right? Because you get to see the different avenues that were followed, what worked, what didn't work. And one of the solutions for this before the advent of computers was, lab notebooks. You kept track of the date of things, the observed data, annotations about that. But now there's a lot more computational science going on, as you can all attest to, and you have different problems here. You got large volumes of data. You can do lots of different computations. You can do parameter sweeps over all different kinds of things. And so keeping track of all of this information is something that becomes a bit tedious. You don't want to have to write it all down. Manually annotating it is fine, but you don't want to have to write it all down. And this leads into another goal that's been talked about a lot in the past couple days at least, which is reproducibility. So this is a photo from Argonne's Rube Goldberg contest that they hold on the years. And so these machines, if you're familiar with Rube Goldberg devices, you've got all these little pieces that have to work together. You start a ball rolling and that makes some sound which a sensor picks up, and it goes on to do some very interesting task. But making sure that all of those components are set up correctly, and making sure that you can, once you did it once, you can do it again by resetting everything correctly is something that takes a lot of precision, a lot of keeping track where things are, right? So being able to reproduce a run like this and do it over and over again is something that can be problematic. And the same thing occurs in computational science, I think. You see the paper, the top of the iceberg, but there's a lot of stuff that goes on beneath that. There's visualizations, there's the data, there's workflows, there's the machines that these results were run on, right? All of that information is important if you really want to think about reproducing the result. And there's been a lot of press on reproducibility in science and other publications. But the goal is can we capture how the results were achieved, not just the fact that there is a result and what it says. And by sharing this sort of information, you can improve collaboration and hopefully advance science in some way. And this reproducibility, I think of it as a bit as a spectrum, right? You can repeat exactly what was done in one experiment. Somebody sends you their code. You can run it with the right parameters for that code. And then there, you might move up a little bit. You want to tweak the parameters, change them a little bit, right? Or you can even go all the way to try to reuse what's been done before and add on to it, extend it, reuse past work. So here's a picture of the Padres ballpark, okay, in San Diego. They built this new ballpark, but they kept the Western Metal Supply building as part of the ballpark. And you can argue here maybe it would have cost less if they just teared it down and put it in a normal stadium, but it certainly gives the stadium character. And in many cases for scientific work, if you use something that's already there, it often makes your life a lot easier. And then this goes beyond just reusing and extending a piece of work. You can look at maybe all the different computations that have been done before. So things like visualization pipelines. If I take a whole database of those, I can mine that information and try to get out some of the common patterns in how those visualizations were generated, some common visualization pipelines. So that's what's going on there. And I think this all leads into this idea of reproducibility, reuse, in really supporting exploration and learning. So when Jefferson sent out Lewis and Clark, it wasn't to just go on a very well-defined route to the West Coast. It was explore the best route, find me the best waterways and things to take. Is there a waterway that goes all the way to the West Coast that we can navigate very easily? And so by when they did that, they kept these crazy maps of all the different places they went. But it wasn't something where they were told you must go a certain way. It wasn't encumbered by a lot of restrictions, right? And we want to support this in science. We want to have this same sort of unencumbered exploration and learning. It's not just this linear path from data or simulation through to some products where we look at them and say, oh yeah, I understand what's going on, and then we sort of throw it away, right? What goes on is you find out something from that initial computation, and you want to go back and rerun a new computation, change some parameters, change the technique that you're using at the time. And these processes are iterative. So you're doing data analysis, visualization, these are going to be iterative. And this change is really the norm. And so there's a quote from the psychologist Donald Norman on this, and he says, sort of the problems involved in this exploration. It says that reflective reasoning requires the ability to store temporary results, to make inferences from stored knowledge, and to follow chains of reasoning backward and forward, and sometimes backtracking when a promising line of thought proves to be unfruitful. And that process is slow and laborious, right? So, keeping track of all the things you've tried, keeping track of all these explorations, that's something that can take a lot of mental capacity or a lot of notes if you have to do that. So if we have external aids, or what Ben Schneiderman calls creativity support tools, that can really help speed up the exploration process and keep track of this information that you would want to have for reproducibility and reuse. So I've come across these sort of 6 terms that I've pulled out. They're not meant to be in any way conclusive or sort of all-encompassing or anything like that, but I think they're interesting pieces that I find out while working with the VisTrails project. And this project's been around for about 10 years now. It was started by Claudio Silva and Juliana Frey. I've been with it for, I guess, the last 8 years now, but there's a lot of developers involved and a lot of users that have also given good feedback. And so I certainly want to make sure that they are not acknowledged. And the system is really focused on this idea of provenance, keeping comprehensive provenance for computational tasks, and also focusing on supporting the exploration. So to do so, it's going to try to transparently, as much as automated as possible, keep track of the provenance of the discovery process. So the trail followed as people generate and test hypotheses, and really streamline that exploration in a usable way. If you want to check out information on it, vistrails.org is the website. It's on GitHub. We're trying to become more Python compliant. Sort of, it's a monolithic Python application right now, but we have it in PyPy now, and there's a lot of work to try to make it more standard. It can be installed with Python, but there are a few dependencies that we're making automated through the different installers there. There's users, groups, wikis, and there's a lot of different users in different disciplines and countries. So to highlight a couple of those, this is the software for automated habitat modeling out of the USGS in Fort Collins. And what they're interested in is looking at the spread of invasive species. And so they have different models that they run to do this, because you can't send a scientist out and check every spot of BLM land for an invasive species. You need to be able to sample different places and use remote sense data to try to get at some of this stuff. And so what they need to be able to track is what the models they used are, what the different parameters they used are, what the data layers that are involved, and so on and so forth. And so there's a workflow that goes behind this so that they keep track of all of that information. Another example that I've been involved with is UVCDAT, and they're focused on climate science. And so they sort of want to have a higher level interface over some of the VisTrails framework that I'll talk about later. So you have things like workflows and pipelines behind the scenes, but really the interface is just variables and plots that can be involved here. Okay, and there's some more pretty pictures of visualizations going on. And then a final example is the ALPS project. And these folks are doing large-scale quantum simulations out in ETH Zurich. And so they have this whole pipeline where they have not only the parameters for the simulation, but also the analyses and the plots that they run on those simulation results. And they wanted to keep track of all of that information, keep track of all of that provenance, so that if you want to go back and understand what happened 5 years ago, you can go back and figure that out and know exactly what data was used, exactly what processes were followed there. And I'll come back to this example in another context later. So I'm going to do a very quick demo here just to sort of show you what VisTrails is. But I think to best understand it, it's easiest to see it in action. So this is a very simple example. I'm not using any high-performance computing resources here. I just want to give you an idea of how the provenance is captured, how exploration is supported. So actually, as I run that example, I should show you what I'm talking about first. And that is MTA fare data. So New York City has a subway system, obviously, and they collect all the swipes of people going around on the subway system. And the Wall Street Journal ran this story on sort of the trends of, as fares increased, what happened in ridership in different places. And they use this data that's available on the web from the MTA. And it's a bunch of CSV files that give you for every week how many swipes there are of the different fare types at different terminals that they record. And so you can look at these CSV files and do something. In Wall Street Journal did these nice graphics on it, but they sort of were limited to this time period before and after the fare increase. And I said, well, why can't we do similar things and explore this data for whatever time step? And so here's sort of this raw data coming in. You can see it doesn't parse very well because there's these top 2 lines, and I can fix that quickly by changing a parameter here. So these different boxes are the computational modules, so something like download file, CSV file, and I can change this parameter where I skip the first 2 lines so that I can get something that's a little more understandable. And so now I have a new example where, okay, the column names were picked up correctly and things like that. But understanding this is, interesting. It's just a bunch of tabular data, though. So what we'd really like to do is use more visual means of getting at this information. And so the Wall Street Journal provided a JSON file that contains where the stations are here. And so I can run that and actually plot all the different stations. And this just uses Google Maps Web API to plot this stuff. But here, all I can see is where these stations are. That doesn't really tell me anything about how the fares are. So I need to join these tables together. And I can do something like make a heat map. And again, I'm going to execute the workflow. So what I'm showing here in this tree is all the different versions that I followed throughout the thing. So if I click on the heat map here, you can see what the workflow is. Right, I'm downloading files here, I'm parsing a JSON, I join these tables together, and I generate a heat map, and I get a visualization like this, which shows that most of the ridership is in Manhattan. There's an interesting little spot up there in the Bronx. Sorry, but what I want to first do is go and explore this heat map a little bit. So I can do something like parameter exploration, a parameter sweep, using VisTrails as well. So I can do something like change the radius of influence on the heat map, do something like 10 to 20, do it over 3 steps. And you can then visually compare these different runs as you run the different workflows. And again, we're keeping track of all these runs. And now you can see that the radius of influence has sort of a way of spreading out where you can sort of identify the individual stations in the left-hand side, and it sort of gives you more of a general picture as you move to the right. So if we look at one of those specific stops, 161st and River, we can do some more complicated analysis and bring in tools like matplotlib, where we actually run over a bunch of different dates, try to look at the different weeks, pull out the different full fares that were spent on those weeks and plot them in a bar. And you'll see that group up there in the map module. What's going on is we're actually iterating through and getting fare data for each one in the date range, plotting that for the map. And then I should have done this on the original sheet. But what that gives us is a nice plot of what's going on there. And the interesting thing, once this plot comes up, is you'll see there are spikes on certain weeks. Sort of tails off once you get to November. But there are spikes on August 16, September 9, September 27. If you know your New York geography, East 161st and River Avenue, that's where Yankee Stadium is. So these spikes actually correspond to when the Yankees have home games. So it's kind of an interesting exploration there. I talked about this history of what all the different versions are here, and I can go click on any one like you saw me doing to sort of get back to those things. But I can also see what happens when I execute one of those workflows. So here's my 2 runs of 161st and River, and I can see the timing of when that was run, the different modules that were run. If there were errors, those would also appear, and I get a key of seeing what computations have run and what ones haven't. Okay, so that is a whirlwind tour of VisTrails, and this is just showing the workflows. So in terms of the provenance, which is really what I want to get to, right? I showed you a lot about the workflows and how VisTrails works, but what I want to talk about is how this provenance is captured and what sort of information is there. And so one of the things with this tree that I showed is that this workflow evolution provenance is actually capturing all of the steps that are explored as you go explore this MTA data, or as I went and explored this MTA data, right? So each one of these versions has a workflow associated with it that generated some visualization. And furthermore, if I look at the changes from one to the other, there's a set of specified changes for all of the actions that I'm doing as I'm modifying the workflow. And so if I look at these 2 workflows specifically and look at what's going on in between, there's this delete modules, I'm adding different modules, I'm changing the parameters, there's a lot of steps that go around there. And instead of sort of trying to figure this out as a version control system would do, because you're working in this workflow environment, you can actually capture all of those changes as you go along. And so you get this provenance of exactly what's going on in the environment there. Okay, and then I showed the execution provenance. That's the other side. So this first side of what the workflow is, how the workflow is changing, that's what's been called prospective provenance, whereas the execution provenance is what was actually run. That's also called retrospective provenance. I'm going to skip over this. But the idea is one problem with this is as you change versions, as you change what the code's doing, you have to look at workflow upgrades, and so you can get the provenance of how those upgrades occur too, because you don't want to be stuck rerunning the same thing over and over again. If there are new tools, if there are new versions that fix bugs, you want to be able to change that, but also keep records of the fact that any old runs use the old workflows, use the old modules. So you want to keep provenance there. Another piece that comes into play here is you say, well, I don't want to use a workflow system, but keeping track of the state, keeping track of the history is still something that's interesting. And so you look at a tool like Maya or ParaView, and these things have these wonderful user interfaces already. You're not going to convince people to go put everything into a workflow form, but maybe they might like to have that same sort of history that you see that I've shown with the VisTrails workflow engine. And so one of the things that we worked on was trying to add this same functionality to Maya, to ParaView, a bit with Visit, and then an internal tool. And the idea here is as you play around with the ParaView interface, all of the state changes can be captured and piped out as provenance information that VisTrails can capture. And then you can, as you make changes, that pops up different versions, and you can click on those versions and immediately go back and forth. So your exploration as you undo, redo changes is all captured here. You don't have to worry about saving a file each time or saving out the history all the time. And there's an alternative view of sort of a tabular view if you don't want to see the tree, sort of sort by the type of information that's there as well. Okay, so that's capturing provenance, but really I think the power from provenance comes from querying that provenance, from reusing that provenance, right? Keeping the historical record is great when somebody comes to you and says, well, I don't believe your result. I don't, where was your input data from? What, what type of solver did you use, et cetera, right? But really, I think the power of provenance comes from actually being able to query that, to get information from it, to reuse that provenance information. And so in terms of querying provenance, you can ask questions, normal data provenance things like, what input data sets contributed to an output image? Or what were the types of computations that happened there? And if you try to do this for complicated enough queries, you get into things like graph traversal or graph patterns. And one of the solutions that VisTrails came up with, that has also come up in the workflow, the business workflow community, is querying workflows by examples. So sort of what you see is what you query. And so there's an interface in VisTrails where you can query the same way as you would build a workflow. Another piece of this is really getting at the data provenance side of things, and how do we link the provenance with the data, right? If I write out a log file that says, these files, my data /0512-sc2.dat, that file may exist on my local computer, and if I keep that provenance and that file in the exact same place, I can go back and figure that out. But otherwise, I'm going to run into file not found if I try to repeat this experiment, if I try to reproduce it, right? So file names are often the mode of exploration or the identification when you're exploring a bunch of data. But really, it would be better to have URIs or curated data stores. But if you don't have that, can we do better things at least? Can we keep track of the hashes? Can we keep track of ways to go find, via provenance what the input data files were if all I have now is this result file that's sitting in a directory somewhere? And so if we have some provenance, if we have that coupled with possibly just a local data store, you can take a file, hash its contents, query the file store for information, go look at the provenance that's associated with that file, and then obtain what the input data was that was used to generate that file. And then go, we can examine what those input files were and actually pull those back out of the repository. So you can get back to the original results, because often when you generate a result, you keep that result, but you don't always keep what the original input files are. You go back and change those input files. And so by keeping better track of that in the provenance, that's something that can really help out there. There's a couple techniques, I showed this earlier, on really focusing on visualization pipelines, trying to do completions for visualization pipelines like you would do with web browser now, in terms of just start typing and you try to get some things there. The same idea can apply to visualization pipelines, where you try to complete the pipelines using a database of pipelines, just doing some data mining here. And so then you can suggest to the user, okay, here's a data set reader, what sort of things make sense there? And it's data driven, so whatever pipelines you have in the repository, whatever provenance you have already is really going to drive what's going on in the suggestion interface. And another technique is, since we have this provenance that says I added a module, I changed a parameter, can we use that information to actually automate some of the tasks that are rather mundane, right? So I want to smooth meshes. Okay, so I know I smoothed this mesh from in the upper right corner from the one in the upper left corner. Can I do the same sort of smoothing to the one in the lower left corner, right? And so if you can sort of automate this process and say, well, I know what steps were taken in that transition on the upper cells, can I do that same transition on the lower cells? And because we have not only the workflows, but also the actions that transform the workflows in the upper row together, you can think about this like analogies. So you have a result, A is to B, and you want to take this improved visualization in C and generate the same sort of report here, right? And so this would be easy if everything lined up exactly. But the problem is that the difference that you compute from A to B doesn't necessarily match up with what C looks like. And so you actually have to find a map between the starting workflows A and C that sort of says, okay, well, a VTK actor and a VTK volume are close enough together, or a file and an HTTP file are close enough together. They're both files, right? And then you can use that map difference then to actually run the sort of analogy. And there's some tools to try to make higher level interfaces here with mashups. Okay. So that's querying and sort of trying to make use of provenance information. And then one final thing I'd like to talk about is provenance in the wild. The folks at ETH Zurich actually went out and said, can we sort of build this provenance information into a publication? Does it work with real publishers right now? And there have been some efforts to really make this better. But what they have in this published paper that Michael Friedman and his co-authors published is you can go click on each one of the figures and it can load in, it can download a VisTrails workflow. And then you can go and actually run the same workflows and change the parameters and get different plots from the analysis that's published out there. One interesting thing is that there was sort of a chicken and egg problem with the journal where because the workflow links were supplemental material, they had to know the URLs of the paper before they could generate the supplemental material, but they also had to have the paper submitted before they could generate the supplemental links and stuff like that. So they had to go through a special process to actually get this to work. But this goal of really trying to publish provenance-rich publications where you can actually go out and get all of the stuff that's underneath the surface of the iceberg, the data, the workflows that are involved there, is something that hopefully produces more knowledge. You can have reviewers that can actually go check results a little better. Authors can be more careful. There's more eyes to sort of see what's going on. You don't have to build everything that's published yourself. And so hopefully this reduces the time to insight. And so this sort of carries through the whole idea of going from data through computations to visualizations and into publications. And there's some work on sort of exposing this on the web, supporting sort of online explorations that you don't have to have VisTrails installed or some other system like that. You can sort of browse on the web and make the same sort of parameter explorations or changes to parameters and have them run there instead. And then one final application is actually kind of cool with teaching scientific visualization. This VisTrails tool was actually used with a couple of courses at the University of Utah. And so you could actually see how students attack problems, because instead of just submitting sort of their final solutions of a visualization assignment, they actually submitted the whole provenance of how they got to their solutions. So you could see the different approaches. You could see comparisons between how students approach the problems. And then you can also assess sort of, what's making sense to them, what's not making sense to them. And you can do things like get activity histograms and see that, oh yeah, during the beginning of the semester, people worked on it, many days before the deadline. When you get to the end of the semester, it stacks up very close to the deadline. No big surprise, right? Something that is a little more interesting is, there are some users that sort of have very well thought out ways of how they're going to attack a problem. They probably understand the material well. There are others that sort of took I just want to try anything and sort of branch off and try whatever to see what works, right? And so you have these different approaches of exploration going on.
Are they both correct?
User one didn't always get to the right solutions. Okay. And so I talked about at the beginning about sort of these 6 terms: orchestration, abstraction, quality, reproducibility, reuse, and through to exploration. And I hope I sort of highlighted how VisTrails has sort of gotten into those different pieces, with the workflows, orchestration, and abstraction, with the ideas of quality, keeping track of the provenance for reproducibility and reuse, and really trying to make this more automated and transparent to support the exploration. With that, I'd be happy to take any questions. And if you want more information, VisTrails.org has ways to download the system. You can play around with it and find out more information. Thank you.
Questions?
Can you describe a little bit more about how the graph querying works?
Yeah. So, well, I didn't show it. I did a little more work on the graph querying that's not here. But one of the things that I've thought about is trying to do sort of a wildcard style query, but in a graph sense, which obviously becomes hard because you have subgraph isomorphism and things like that, which can be computationally difficult. But the idea would be, I want to have a bunch of workflows that read data from a certain source and use a certain type of algorithm, and that's all I care about. I don't care about what happens in between, but I need to make sure that that data is actually processed in a certain way. So you have this sort of wildcard query where you have a module, another module, and this link that says, I need some path through the graph. And so then you end up going into these fun things of how can you index a bunch of workflows to try to make those queries faster. And there's been a lot of work in the database community on how to do that efficiently with graph-style queries and things like that. It's not the large graph stuff that you see with the Facebook social graphs that there's also been a lot of work on, but there's been a lot of work on sort of how do you ask queries about a large collection of smaller graphs. And I can point you to that work if you're interested.
So the journal publication, actually. So has anybody else done that?
There have been a few things. I mean, Elsevier ran a executable paper challenge, and they've since adapted one of those tools that was entered there to sort of try to help authors. I don't know how well it's been going. I haven't followed up on as much on that, but I do know that there are publishers that are very interested in trying to get to more of these reproducible publications. But I think it's still easier to do sort of your own website where you can download the information rather than the publisher's sites. But the publishers, their carrot there is sort of like that they're around, or they're planning to be around at least for a long while, and so they can put their data there. If your website goes down or anything like that, they'll have it there, and so that's why they've been trying to convince people to move to their sites for supplemental material.
But actually, just following up on the same question. So I didn't quite get. So what you're going to have in the publication are going to be your variables that you use in the program, or your parameters, the value, or the whatever the name, right? Or both.
So the idea with that publication is actually that you have not only the data, but you have the whole workflow that was used to compute this. So you have the matplotlib settings that were used, the data that was read in, the processing that was done to do this analysis and things like that.
And what are you going to do with three-dimensional simulation?
How would you present that sort of a result?
Put the data there.
Yeah, because there's just too much data.
So much data.
Yeah. No, there are certainly.
It's nice. It's
Yeah.
just a one-dimensional graph, and there are just a couple of.
Yeah, and I think this works best where you have analyses, not necessarily sort of the raw data from the simulation. If you can sort of boil it down into some summarized data, publish that, and publish the analyses on that. But yeah, taking sort of the raw simulation results or something like that, making those available, that's just not going to scale very well. I agree.
And the flow, it might be maybe characteristic to your particular implementation, I guess. That's what I understand, right?
So yeah, I mean, so there are workflows that depend on, it's an extensible package system. So you can add in different packages for like matplotlib, for VTK, those exist in VisTrails right now. But yeah, if you had your code that does ecological simulations, that has to be made available as well as a package that then users can download along with. So it'd be another piece of the equation: the package, the code, the data, the workflow, things like that.
There's an ACM journal called Transactions on Mathematical Software, which might be a good one because the idea is you always submit your source for the routine as well as the article is described.
Right.
So are there features within VisTrails to help keep track of workflow elements that are HPC specific? Like, I mean, generally speaking, when I think of an HPC workflow, I think of things like taking things in and out of version control, writing submission scripts, submitting jobs, moving files around from the output. I mean, can any of that be captured in this system?
Yeah, well, I mean, so you can always write a module that does that sort of stuff. It's the easy way around this answer, right? But we have done some more work trying to get at these situations specifically and making, you know, there's this, Swift talked a lot about how you can sort of map these higher level workflows and map them to computations correctly and support HPC that way. That's another sort of goal of where we want to go down the line. But in terms of, we have had some setup where, yeah, you do the setup scripts as modules to kick off the exports and things like that for the version control. And then you sort of just call out to the HPC machine to run the simulation, and then you pull back the data after that. But it's something that's a bit clunky at the time. We're trying to improve that.
Any other questions? All right, let's thank David again.
Thank you.